The agenda this week assessed efforts to get more houses built in Ontario, examined the immigration backlog, and learned why our brains may be hardwired to keep us from reacting to threats as big as climate change. The agenda's week in review begins with labor rights and the notwithstanding clause.
You know, the strike card is a very powerful card to play, obviously, right? When kids are out of school, parents are upset. And they're not just upset at the government, they're upset at the unions, they're upset at everything. They just want the situation to be fixed. But that being said, the government can't just back down every single time that card is played, because if they do, I mean, you know, it's going to be played all the time in every single situation.
Alison, you want to come back on that?
Well, yes. I mean, I think it's important to note that, of course, we are not at the table, right? So, I mean, I don't know, and no one who's not really there and who hasn't been living and breathing this for weeks and months really knows all the nuances and the back and forth. Catherine, you yourself say you negotiate, then you know these things. I don't know how much longer the union is supposed to negotiate with no traction. Is it another month? Is it 5 months? Is it 2 years? I mean, it's not for us, I don't think, to second guess. But I think it's also important to note that it's a rare thing to use this lightly, largely because unions know that they run the risk of being legislated back to work. So this characterization that unions willy-nilly drop the strike intent every time it's not going their way is fundamentally poppycock. It's a considered decision. It's a thoughtful decision. It's a very hard thing to be on a picket line. I don't know if you've ever been on one, Catherine, but it's a hard thing to be on a picket line. And it's a hard thing to lead a strike. I don't know if you've ever done that either. So it is not a willy-nilly thing that unions do, at least not in this day and age.
Okay, speaking of just because you can doesn't mean you should, that leads me to the notwithstanding clause. Because the reality is it has been part of the Charter of Rights and Freedom. The opportunity to use the notwithstanding clause has been in the Charter of Rights and Freedom since 1982. But in its wisdom, no previous government of Ontario has ever used it or even mused about using it, threatened to use it, and so on.
Or any other province.
Well, Quebec.
I don't think it's been used. In Quebec, was it used to impose a contract?
Oh, that I don't know.
That's
no,
what I mean in a labor dispute.
Oh, I see what
my
you're
apologies.
saying. In a labor dispute.
Yeah.
Right. So I guess my question is, this is now, I mean, Doug Ford used it, Cynthia, to bring in campaign finance reform.
Yes.
He threatened to use it to overturn a decision about the size of Toronto City Council, ultimately got a better court decision, didn't have to do it. Threatened to use it in this case as well. Again, rescinding for now. I guess the question is, just because you have the power to do something, should you do something? Want to get into some discussion about that?
Well, I think this morning Doug Ford proved maybe not.
I mean, it's there in the Constitution. It's there in the Charter. So some people have said if it's there, you ought to be allowed to use it. Others have said it's not a coincidence that it hasn't been used in the last 36 years. Mm-hmm. Where do you think the preponderance of evidence comes down in this case?
Well, I think with public perception, I think from that poll, if we're going to believe that poll, I think people are uncomfortable with the use of it in this situation. And I think Doug Ford got that message loud and clear, and I think that's why we're seeing what has transpired this morning.
What about it, Catherine? Do you think the circumstances of this situation justified the threatened use of the notwithstanding clause?
Overall, I think the circumstances did justify it. You know, Alison, no, I've never been on a picket line or led a union movement, but I've sat down with a very frustrated, upset 6-year-old and tried to teach her core skills when I'm not a trained teacher, and seeing her be isolated and lonely and crying and missing her friends. And you know, fundamentally, the government has a really important role, which is obviously to protect our public institutions. And at the end of the day, you know, they have to, yes, the core rights are really important that are enshrined in the Charter, but what about the rights of the millions of kids to be in school? And that isn't something to be overlooked. And look, I don't think that the notwithstanding clause should be used lightly. I mean, it is used frequently in Quebec. We do tend to forget that. I think we're probably going to see it used more in the labor context. The right to strike is a relatively new one. It wasn't recognized until 2015. And the reason why we're going to see it more frequently in the labor context is with public sector unions. If there is a strike and there is a shutdown, it impacts millions of people. And there's plenty of people who would argue that education workers are essential service because school and education is essential. So I think we're actually going to see it used more often, hopefully not lightly, but this isn't the end. This is a new time, I think, for labor public sector negotiations.
Well, listen, I think it was Andrew Coyne from the Globe and Mail who said if you leave a loaded gun lying around long enough, someone eventually is going to pick it up and use it. And it may be that for 36 years, no government of Ontario took this path, but this Premier clearly has a different view of it. Is the clause there to be used, in your view?
Not in the case like this. I mean, it's absurd, frankly. And I'll tell you why it's absurd. Because if the one thing that I think most commentators can agree upon is that it was not meant to serve every political peccadillo that any government has, then how do you use it in the context of a right that, although, yes, only given constitutional protection in the last 7 years, has been around very much in the same form for almost 80 years? The statutory framework that we have developed over 80 years that allows for the designation of an unlawful strike. And think about that for a moment. We don't have a dictatorship. We don't have a slave economy, but you can be fined for not going to work. That's an unlawful strike. How do you make a strike unlawful in the context of a democracy? Well, you do it because you exchange something for it. And what you exchange for that labor piece, for labor to buy into the fact that they can't just walk off the job every time they're unhappy, that they have to stay there while there's a contract in place, then you give them a means to achieve that decent contract.
We have always been a bit of a outlier relative to the industry in that we fundamentally believe that we are stewards, we are not owners. And as generational stewards, the decisions we make today and the implications they have for future generations needs to be fundamentally considered. Our industry has been stuck doing things the way they've always known how to do them, but it's time for innovation. It's time for change. We need to be thinking about the environmental impact that our buildings have and the way that we build our cities and the contributions they have to both the carbon footprint, but to the broader sort of environmental assets that we have. And so I completely concur that it can't be a wholesale sort of approach where you sort of, you don't build housing at any cost, because the housing is part of an ecosystem. It's part of society, and the environmental contributions and the environmental role are fundamental for future generations, and we can't sort of spite them in terms of just trying to deliver what we need today.
How confident are you that at some point, in this orgy to get housing built, at some point somebody's going to build on a floodplain and a conservation authority is not going to be allowed to make a deputation to oppose it, and at the end of the day, this is not going to work out?
I'm 100% confident that if there aren't changes in the bill, which I hope that Ina's right, it will be iterations, and before it's passed, things will be changed. I'm 100% confident that will happen. And I think it's important to talk about the environment as something for our kids, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about things being destructive now. We have more floods already than we experience. If you've been on a floodplain, it's not just that the houses in that neighborhood get flooded. It changes floodplains for everybody nearby. So existing houses also are a higher risk. I'm not talking about things going wrong in 20 years when my kids are grown up. I'm talking about someone buying a house and their basement flooding 2 years later. And what most people don't know is that your home insurance doesn't cover that. Because the risk of flood has been going up so quickly, floods are being pulled out of almost everybody's home insurance. And then also, the bill as currently written makes green standards not viable, which means that all new homes built would be much more expensive to run. And if the bill passes as currently written, I see a thing in a couple years where like, oh, we've got to be careful not to buy a house that came in after 2022 because my energy bills will be twice as high.
I think we have to be a bit careful here, because my understanding of the legislation as it relates to conservation authorities is it's specifically saying conservation authorities should continue to play a role in exactly what you're talking about, of anything that relates to floods, natural hazards, or personal safety. I think the intention is to rein in the level of involvement. And I've got a colleague that runs a habitat in a smaller Ontario community. They've got a 4-unit development that's not even in a floodplain. The fees they have to pay to their local conservation authority for their approval process is more than they're paying to the municipality for the rest of the development fees.
Hold that thought. Would you agree that doesn't make any sense?
Yes.
Okay. consensus. Keep going.
There you go. So, well, I think that, and I think we are all concerned about things like green standard and the way buildings are built. And for me, when I first heard that, I assume I'm working in the part that's in the unintended, that's an unintended consequence. I think it's been talked about a lot, and I would sure hope to see adjustments that get made as we see this go through the multiple readings.
But I think it also highlights a bigger systematic issue in the process, which we talked about in the kinds of delays, is that the system is working in silos. The departments within the municipality work in silos. Then you have externals like conservation authorities who work in their silos. So all of a sudden, when you're going through an application process, you get clearance from one group, and then another group steps in and says, actually, no, we don't approve it. And then you cycle back again, and then you cycle back again.
What's the alternative to that?
Well, it's about the alignment, right? It's about having people, it's about actually looking at the inputs to the process and aligning them up front and ensuring that you actually have consensus within the system and everyone shows up as a partner, not as yet again another layer to sort of get through.
And I'd say it's about balancing authority. Right. And this was the Housing Affordability Task Force, of which I was a member. A lot of it was about how do we get a better balance, because the challenge is inadvertently in the need to have everyone involved. Heritage parks, transportation, local neighbors. That the experience for those of us trying to build homes is housing is what you get. Housing is what comes out the other end, what's left over after you consider all of those things. So I think what the effort here is to say, how do we achieve a better balance of these considerations? Because we do, per what you put on the screen at the beginning, we have we have a real housing crisis for people who are suffering every day because of their need for a place that works for their family.
But Jacob, I gather you would like to see what they're calling more gentle density. I mean, we're not talking about 50-story condos going up in every neighborhood, but somewhat more. Will this get us there?
It'll get us partly there. So, part of that point about triplexes and allowing up to 3 units, it'll get us part of the way there. But what that doesn't help right now, at least, is the part about feasibility on every single plot and making that economically feasible and also physically feasible with all the other rules surrounding.
What happened is by October of last year, the government said, we filled all of the quota for 2022 in October 2021, which is why there was a stop on draws for express entry until July of this year. What that meant was now the pool for express entry had been building up. And as Mikhail has said, express entry is about skimming the cream. So you take the top of whoever's in the pool. Now, when you have an inventory, before usually there's a draw every 2 weeks, people can, you're skimming the pool every 2 weeks. You haven't skimmed the pool for 9 months since October. That cream is very, very thick.
It's very thick, yes.
Okay? And so as a result, the draws have been extraordinarily high. And so what happens is many people who would have other qualified for permanent residence, especially international students who have studied, who have worked, and all of a sudden their work permits are going to expire, there's a big issue.
Okay. Do you want to comment on that, or can I read you something?
Well, yeah, I generally agree with what Elizabeth has said. I think I would add just one more thing. With TR to PR, there's again a lack of transparency in my mind. So most of what I've been doing for the last year is taking the government to court essentially on delayed applications with generally excellent results. However, people should not be paying lawyers to file an application for writ of mandamus at the federal court to get the government to do its job. With TR to PR, we've done a few of those files, and we see that there's just no transparency with respect to when a file is going to be processed. The program was meant to be expedited, simplified, etc. We're seeing files that are already pending for 16 months with no end in sight. Those are supposed to be essential workers, healthcare workers, etc. How is that acceptable? That's all I would say on the TR to PR stuff.
Okay. Let me read this here, and then, McCall, I'll get you to comment on this first, because we've seen, well, this is from, I want to read an excerpt from an article titled, "When They Needed Us, They Exploited Us." This is Indian students in Canada. They made front page news of a major news outlet in India last week. And here's an excerpt from this. I want to read this, and then, McCall, I'll get your reaction to it. The foreign graduates were hoping the permit extension would give them more time to gain Canadian work experience and boost their scores under the country's immigration ranking system for skilled workers. But these graduates got caught up in a backlog of applications that led to a 10-month shutdown of the system to allow the government to process them. Once the system was reopened, the students found themselves competing with pools of immigrants with much higher than normal scores, reducing their chances of gaining permanent residency. And obviously, they're very unhappy about that. Okay, McCall, your reaction to all of that?
There's an equity problem, Steve. So the way what economists refer to this as is a horizontal equity problem. In these kinds of systems, you want to ensure that people that are sort of equal are treated equally in the system. And what's happened here, again, as a consequence of trying to hit this target in 2021 and emptying the pool and then letting the pool fill up, is that we've got these very capable students. I mean, I teach a lot of these students, these international students. They would easily clear the bar, you know, that cream, where the cutoff is for the cream. They would easily clear that. But because the way Elizabeth described it is just perfect, the bar is now so much higher because that layer of cream has increased so much that these students who would have had, you know, no trouble clearing the bar in the past now can't.
So what happens to them?
So that's a good question. So that they're given, in Canada, we give these students 3-year open work permits. The question is, what happens to them when those permits end? And that's the troubling issue. Do they stay? Do they work without documentation, thereby potentially becoming more vulnerable to exploitation by employers? Do they try to go back home and get back on a pathway some other way? Do they go back to school? It's all about being on this pathway to permanent residency. And so, yeah, I think, you know, it's the usual thing that these short-term myopic policy decisions often have long-term consequences. And we're seeing the fallout now.
You wrote, when we trigger anxieties, we almost always inadvertently trigger defenses. And when it comes to climate change, these defenses act on everyone from greeny urban liberals to climate science naysayers. Okay, fill in the blanks there. What are some of those defenses?
Gosh, well, we already know so much about how our minds protect us from distressing, unwanted information, just as George outlined in his book. And so we've got already an abundance of insight about this, which can, I think, help us navigate this challenge we're dealing with, these crises. Namely, denial is the obvious, but it's so much more than denial. It's minimizing, it's distancing, there's projection, there's like, it's all on them. There's binary thinking, really the polarization, the black and white, any kind of attempt to simplify and reduce complexity. There's the unconscious mechanism of kind of taking what's potentially guilt-inducing or shame-inducing, like I'm a bad person because I actually love my fossil fuel-powered car, or I love my this or that. If we have these kind of distressing internal feelings, even on an unconscious level, we tend to kind of want to get rid of it and put it out on others. And then that sets in motion this whole dynamic that we see that can make dialogue and conversation and imagination really challenging. So I think the reason why we want to understand defenses is because we want to look at what supports our ability to navigate and work through those defenses. And again, we know a lot about that as well. We know that humans actually need connection and community and support to process difficult information, right? We tend to work really well in small groups, 5 to 7. We also cue off of all the social relationships we're in. But I think where we want to put attention is what are the conditions that allow us as humans to stay with what's hard and stay with what's triggering and foster that resilience to work through it so we can get to, and now what do we want to do about it?
Well, let me pick up on part of that and go to Lise with it. And that is, we're I think, all of us familiar with climate change denial, but there are other less obvious forms, Lise, of denial as well. Do we need to consider some of those here?
Sure. Many of those are unconscious factors. And, some of them, it's sort of climate is a Pandora's box of dark thoughts, really. It requires that we acknowledge that we're not the masters of the universe, that we might like to imagine, that the world is not necessarily the safe place that we would hope. It requires that we embrace uncertainty, etc. And it also triggers, frankly, our personal sense of vulnerability. That is, that we're going to get old, get sick, and die. And climate is like a metaphor for that. So we're avoidant. But let me just say that, building on that, there are two key things, and there are all sorts of other unconscious issues. There's aggression, which, as I have to say, that not recognizing what is happening to future generations or even our children today and the cumulative toll is an unconscious form of aggression. And I think some of us, not all of us, but some of us look at this as a sort of a narcissistic rage that they're going to be here and we're not. And also there's anger, I think, at Mother Earth that she's got a timestamp on our necks. So I think there are embedded unconscious reasons, but we'll get to how to get around these, because there are so many ways that we can grab on to these unconscious forces and all these emotions and turn them into constructive action.
George, let me get you to comment on something that was written by Michael Hoekster, the research scholar from the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, who has coined this term soft climate denialism. And here's what Michael writes. He says, soft climate denial means that one acknowledges in some parts of one's life that climate change is real, disastrous, and happening now, but in most other parts of one's life, one ignores that anthropogenic global warming is, in fact, a real existential emergency and catastrophic. And I wonder, could you speak to this notion of other softer forms of denial being more widespread and dangerous, potentially, than the actual factual denial of climate change?
For a long time, it was the case that if you asked people, is climate change serious, you concerned that large majorities would mention it. But then if you asked them to name the things that they were really concerned about, climate change wouldn't figure. That there was this ability when you were asking people to focus on it, that they said, yes, I really see that this is a problem. But it immediately just drifted away. It dissipated in the air when you tried to ask people to bring it to light. However, I have to say, this is weakening. I think that the difference between these two forms of knowing and not knowing is getting less with time. Certainly, we've already heard that climate change feels distant to people, but actually it's becoming more and more real for people.
That's just some of what we covered this week. You can find more, including the full conversations, on our website, TVO.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.